We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future. Welcome everybody to this event called Making a Radical Constitution. It's been organised by the Claim the Future initiative, working with the Red Paper Collective. For those of you who have been to these events before over the last year, apologise if this is repetitive, but basically for those who haven't, we launched Claim the Future at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was an attempt to bring people together, policy experts, researchers, think tanks and campaigners, and a variety of different campaigns, quite a broad range, to talk about the issues that we were facing as a society, but also to look at the immediate measures that we needed to campaign for, the development of policies, but also trying to look at the sort of society that we wanted to create as we came out of the pandemic. And the idea, it's the old Marxist concept, really, of praxis, bringing together theory and practice. So we were bringing together policy experts, specialists around a whole range of different topics with campaigners, and basically produced individual papers that we put on our website. And at the same time, we brought that together in one pamphlet towards the end of last year. But it wasn't meant to be just a sort of academic exercise. The idea was, let's look at the individual issues that we're facing, look at the sort of solutions that we think should be implemented, but more importantly, I suppose, support those people who are working hard to bring about those solutions. Often it was about identifying existing campaigns and talking to the people who are on the ground working in those campaigns, but also where there were any gaps, really to plant a flag around a particular issue and launch campaigns around that. And just to facilitate any campaign with backup research and, yes, some policy advice as well. It's been a fascinating exercise in bringing people together, and it's producing, I think, for many of us, a way in which we can analyse the world, identify the key issues and for change, and help bring about, I suppose, what many have discussed, the sort of paradigm change that we need. Where we've got to in terms of those discussions now, we've produced all these papers, they're on the website and the pamphlet, have a look at that. But also what we're doing now is, from those discussions, other issues have arisen. So we're bringing people together to talk about those particular issues and continue to launch individual campaigns. One of the issues that came up throughout the discussions was about, how do we organise government? How do we organise the state at all the various levels, local, regional, national, and then also, yes, how do we interact globally as well, and what sort of reforms are required in terms of our state structures, the engagement, our democratic structures, and the reflection that would have on our constitution as well. So that's why we linked up with the Red Paper Collective, who'd done a fair amount of work in convening some of the discussions around this particular issue. And we've got a cycle of 3 online discussions about this particular issue. We've held our first, and this is our second. And our second brings together a range of policy experts who've done a fair amount of work around the constitutional change and what sort of constitutional change that we want. And it is about empowering people. And we make it fairly clear it is about redistribution of wealth and power within our society in favour of working people. And how do we bring that about, and what sort of constitutional changes and democratic changes are required? And we've had some discussions, as I said, in our first session, and this is our second, to try and nourish that debate a bit further. So we've got 4 speakers. I'd like to bring, first of all, into the discussions Pauline Bryan from the Red Paper Collective. and to talk about the paper she produced, the Remaking the British State. I'm always giving Madeleine Williams, who's coordinated all of these events and activities and policy discussions brilliantly, always provides me with a biopic of the individuals. I like the summaries of the biopics, and they largely to embarrass people, I think, actually. So Pauline Bryant now is Baroness Bryant of Partick. We forced her into the Lords. She didn't want to go, but we forced her. She only said she'd only go there on the basis that she'd vote to abolish it. She's a writer on Scottish affairs and a socialist campaigner. As I said, Jeremy Corbyn nominated for a life peerage because we wanted her to lead on constitutional affairs. She's part of the Red Paper Collective, which, as people know, is a group of Labour activists and aiming to provide an alternative from the perspective of the Labour movement to what is this she describes as the sterile nationalist versus unionist debate around the Scottish independent referendums. Over to you, Baroness Bryant.
Yes, I never did like you, John. I should say that the work on the publication Remaking the British State was carried out by Sean Griffin. I could never have undertaken anything of that scale and the depth that he brought to it. So I'm sure we'll be able to get the link for that up on the chat at some point during the session. As John said, I'm in Scotland. Luckily, I'm not in London, forced to attend the House of Lords at this time. It's quite a relief to be in Glasgow full time and not to have to go into what we call the House of Horrors. But there is just so much happening in Scotland now. I mean, who would have thought that in the midst of a pandemic, so much of our news, and I have to say that's UK-wide news, will be devoted to a detailed legal questions going on around Holyrood between the different branches of the government and the Constitution. That far from it being a boring issue of no interest to the majority of people, it's become the meat and drink. It would be the pub talk, if we could be there, of what it means in terms of our society. And I think it's clear now that from 1997, that when you set about making constitutional change in one area, it will have a knock-on effect across others. And that should have been foreseen. As it was, devolution set off a reaction, quite rightly, of questions and demands about what powers and for what purposes. When it became obvious in 2011 that there was going to be a referendum on independence in Scotland, we came together as the Red Paper Collective. It's a group of politicians, trade unionists and academics. And the Red Paper group has argued that any proposed constitutional change should be judged by whether it enables the redistribution of wealth, whether it democratizes our economy, and whether it creates conditions for both solidarity and subsidiarity. The core of what we're saying is really that constitutions aren't neutral. They're framed by those in power to ensure that the state continues to serve their interests. I think the Red Paper believes that the real problems facing the people in Scotland will not be solved by a change of flag, but by a change of politics. So we really welcome the opportunity to work with Claim the Future on this and putting together the 3 sessions. Our aim was to bring together people from across Britain to look at the redistribution of power and wealth and how to make a radical constitution. And the 3rd session in March will be for progressive federalism. And I'm really looking forward to our 3 speakers today. So I'll hand you back to John.
Thanks, Pauline. I'm sorry for pulling your leg about the House of Lords. I really am. I'm sorry for inflicting it on you, but we needed someone there to push this policy through. And the work that Pauline did with regard to the policy paper, we'll try and get up on the comments section on the chat so that people got access to it. It was possibly the most significant document produced by the Labour Party at least over the last decade about where we go from here on constitutional change, and it's stimulated a wide-ranging debate. Our next speaker is part of that debate, James Mitchell from the University of Edinburgh, who's looked at the issues around why constitutions are important, why the UK constitution tilts in favour of the few, the limitations on the reforms since '97. James, as people know, he has an interest in three related areas: constitutional politics, public policy and political behaviour. He works at the University of Edinburgh on politics and policies of local government, and he recently wrote a pamphlet for the Jimmy Reid Foundation setting out constitutional options for Scotland. He's been arguing that current debate has been stuck in a rut dominated by questions of identity at the expense of the debate that we're trying to have, which is about the kind of society and economy that we need. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation and indeed for this initiative. I think it's a really welcome initiative that we're looking at this range of issues, including the Constitution, in this way. I want to start by explaining why I think that constitutions are important and they matter, but equally why they're not all important, that there are other matters that are even more important than constitutions and that we need to link debates up. Constitutions are often seen as kind of maps of power maps, or provide the rules of the game of politics, a bit like in a game of football or any other sport, where you need to have the rules, to agree the rules, to conduct the game and to work out who wins and who loses. Constitutions, if they are rules of the games, if they're power maps and they're biased or unbalanced, then they will favour some over others. And my argument over a long number of years is that the UK Constitution is deeply imbalanced and it's a deeply unfair constitution, and that it gives favour to the few over the many. In a way, the most obvious example of that is, of course, the institution Pauline's just been talking about, and that's the House of Lords. It's extraordinary that in this century we still have a House of Lords appointed in the way that it is, and it certainly is the case that across the globe, when you speak to people who work on constitutions and politics, they are still amazed. They're shocked to discover that we still have this bizarre institution. But there's more, I think, to the UK Constitution than that makes it unusual and I would argue an unfair constitution. The way in which power is hoarded at the centre, the extent to which the executive dominates the legislature, the extent to which effectively it's not only the party in power in London, but the faction of the party in power in London is all powerful and has extraordinary controls. Now, we've certainly seen devolution being delivered to Scotland and Wales, which has, to some extent, addressed that. But ultimately, you know, London can take power away, and theoretically, at least, the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Senate could be done away with, you know, tomorrow by simple legislation passed by Westminster, not dissimilar to what happened to the GLC and the Metropolitan Authorities in the 1980s. At least legally, constitutionally, that's possible. I think politically that would be much more difficult. But nonetheless, what we are actually seeing at the moment is what many people regard as a power grab, a means of using the Brexit changes to take power back from the devolved institutions. So I think that raises all sorts of questions for Scotland and Wales, but even more questions, I think, for the English regions. At the moment, we have a government in power that can simply govern and ignore huge parts of the UK, including English regions. That voice is missing. It's certainly there in Parliament, in opposition, but it's not there at the core of politics. And as I say, I think it can be and is being ignored. It's been treated with contempt. That's a very unhealthy situation. We've got a very top-down approach to politics and the constitution in the UK. I want to stress, however, that constitutions are not all important. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the debates in the constitutions is they start and end with the constitution. And they don't approach it in the way that Pauline outlined in her presentation by asking, well, what's the constitution for? What are we trying to deliver? And are we able to deliver that redistribution in wealth and power that's essential? And I have to say that my strong view is that you cannot redistribute wealth without also redistributing power. They go together, they go hand in hand. And so we need to look and consider how we should do that. So the UK is, I'd say, in my view, an unbalanced constitution. It's an ancient constitution. It's in real need of change. And as Pauline also noted, that we have seen change over the years. It's been pretty piecemeal. I've often referred to that as being constitutional plumbing, that we've seen leaks in the system and there's been an attempt to solve the leaks. What we need now, in my view, is new constitutional architecture, a completely new approach to the constitution, and a lot more joined up thinking. I want to go back to the reforms under the Blair government, because I think they were very interesting and quite important. What we saw then was a whole series of reforms. I won't go through all of them, but devolution was clearly one. We had some attempt at reform in the House of Lords. I think there were a number of problems with those reforms, much as some of it was very welcome and it was a good thing, without doubt, a good start. But I think it was very limited. It was limited both in the sense that it didn't go nearly far enough, particularly the House of Lords, but also it was limited in that it was treated, each of these reforms was treated in a silo. So we devolved government, we reformed the House of Lords, but we never made any attempt to link the two. And again, if you look at this from outside the UK, from other countries, other liberal democracies, what you find is that people would say, well, why don't you do the two together? Why don't you not only devolve within your polity, decentralize power, real power within your polity, but also to ensure that those voices in the regions are to be established very clearly constitutionally at the centre. In other words, have a reformed second chamber, a House of Nations and Regions, rather than a House of Lords. So I think these are the kind of issues that were lost sight of in that constitutional reform programme back in the post-97 period. Now, I understand why it was done. It was done very quickly. There was a clear demand for that. And of course, we've learned a lot since then. But I do think that we need to readdress these questions. And again, as Pauline was indicating, learn lessons of the unintended consequences of some of the changes. Also showing recently, particularly under this government, the weaknesses in the system, where power can actually be sucked back by the centre, as has increasingly happened. And so we really need to, I think, go back and look at some of these issues and start again. And actually start from that point. What is a constitution form? Not the kind of vague notions of modernisation, which was the thread that claimed to bring together that programme in post-97, but to ask ourselves, how do we ensure that we have that proper redistribution of wealth and power? Power is, I think, a central part to any serious analysis of our constitution. So we've got all of these problems. And I think what we're actually seeing are a series of grievances, some evidence that something is not wrong. And I want to offer my take on what's happening here in Scotland and in other parts of the UK, but particularly focusing on Scotland. At the moment, we're seeing a demand for independence. The most recent poll out today suggests that 52% of people in Scotland want independence. There's different ways to read that poll. My reading of that poll is that over half or around half the Scots are showing no confidence in the existing system. We need to ask ourselves, why is that happening? And the argument I would make is that there is a sense in Scotland that we are being neglected, that we've been forgotten, that we're being ignored, that power's been taken away from us. It's less about national identity than that sense of powerlessness, that sense that people are doing things to us rather than allowing us to take control of our own affairs. And I have to be said that that's also a view, I think, within Scotland, because we have a power-hoarding government in Edinburgh as much as we have a power-hoarding government in London. So this is something that needs to be looked at. We don't need to just simply stop at Edinburgh or at Cardiff. We need to consider how we can devolve and decentralise real meaningful power into our communities in a way that we used to do. We used to have this kind of system across the UK of real decentralisation, but there's been a long process, decades-long process of reversing that. That hasn't changed with devolution. I think that's important to note, especially in the English regions. If you decentralise to the English regions, be careful that it doesn't just stop there. It needs to go further. We anticipated in Scotland that once we had devolution, then we would see local government revived. And there was a great deal of discussion, debate around that. Well, the truth of the matter is that each successive administration, Liberal Democrat and SNP, have centralised power in Edinburgh. So we've got to guard against that happening. We've got to work out how we continue this process of devolving and decentralising, because at the end of the day, the real vitality and many of the ideas exist in our communities. This is where our people live. This is where we live. We don't live in central block. We live in our communities. So I would argue that the grievance that we are seeing manifested in the demand for Scottish independence today is actually a little different from the grievances, legitimate grievances, that are being articulated in Wales, where we're seeing growing support for independence. It's only about 23%, I think, from the latest poll, but that's a remarkable proportion in Wales. That's around the same level. It's not far short of the level of support for independence in Scotland back in 2011. And indeed, the sense of grievance, legitimate grievance, that have been articulated in English regions. In the previous session of this, I was fascinated to listen to the discussion that took place there on the English regions and the kind of concerns that were being articulated, which are very similar to those you will find in Wales and today in Scotland. So long as we don't address these, I think we will see that demand for independence growing. It's been made manifest in a demand for independence, but if we look deeper, there is something else going on. National identity is certainly being used to mobilise that grievance in a particular direction, but it needn't be mobilised in that way if we've got new ideas and if there's leadership and mobilisation behind it. So where should we go with this? Well, I want to argue that actually the best starting place is, in fact, the work that Pauline has been doing. And the report that Sean Griffin wrote for Pauline, or with Pauline, which I think is a remarkable document. And I've been studying this subject for 40 odd years now. And I've heard many people say we need a federal constitution. And I have spent many years saying, what does that actually mean? I have to say, this is the first time I've come across a document that takes that idea seriously and also places it into the idea of redistributing wealth and power. It doesn't start by saying, let's see whether we should be British or Scottish, whether we should have an independent state or union or whatever. It starts by asking, how do we redistribute wealth and power? How do we empower our people and our communities? That alone, I think, makes the document a very valuable contribution to the debate. But it's also important because it links up debates that should be taking place. So, for example, it recognises that we can't just decentralise, have more devolution. So there's some really interesting suggestions, detailed suggestions in the document on that. It also recommends that we should have a House of Nations and Regions, which strikes me as an obvious way forward, because where we have been pretty poor, I think, is looking at the need to reform the centre. We always say, let's decentralise, but we don't do much of that, but we don't reform the centre, where I think the grievance starts from. So I think that's a hugely important contribution that's been made. The other aspect of it, I think, that's really important is that it is linked to other debates. So the idea of a national investment bank, which is often not seen as a constitutional question, is brought into the discussion. And a suggestion is made, for example, that institution should have the same constitutional status as the Bank of England. And of course, it also argues that there should be regional representation, the regional voice in these institutions. So it has a much broader understanding of what a constitution is than is often traditionally taken for granted. And I think that's a really very, very welcome part of the discussion. The other thing that I think is really notable is that there are similar debates taking place elsewhere. In Wales, we've got the idea of radical federalism being developed by a section of the Labour Party, and I think it's a really interesting idea. There is nothing that's been said in Wales on that idea that would not sit very comfortably and happily with Pauline's work and Sean's work and his report. And I think it'd be really interesting to bring together some of that thinking, because while the details may be different and the particular prescriptions for different parts of the UK may not be the same, there is, I think, an overall logic and philosophy that they all have in common. And so I think we can see the beginning of something very, very important. There's so many aspects of the report that I could spend a lot of time talking further about it. I hope I've conveyed one thing, that I think it's an extremely important document and it's extremely exciting. And it's a long document, it's over 200 pages. It's very unusual for political parties to put so much detail into a document, and congratulations for doing that. Of course, there will be elements that people might disagree with. There may be elements people very strongly disagree with. But as a document to provoke discussion, it really is second to none in terms of the stuff that we're talking about this evening, in my view. So my final point is to recommend that you all do get a copy of it, take it, read it, digest it, debate it, discuss it, and keep this going. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks, James. I'm glad you've reconfirmed my view. I think Pauline's document is, I think, the most significant, at least in the last decade, if not more. Yeah. And the whole point of it being long is that it's comprehensive. And we've never had a comprehensive approach before. And I know Pauline's had her battles over it, production and all the rest of it, and getting it out there. But I think it's a breakthrough document, and Pauline's work on it has just been phenomenal. Our next speaker is Arianna Giovannini. She's from De Montfort University, Leicester, and she's focusing on the case of England and the main issues underpinning the English question, the lack of constitutional debate recently on the case for England, and as she says, they're just sort of incoherent patchwork model of devolution in different forms. Arianna, she's the associate professor reader in local politics and public policy. She's the deputy director of the local government's research centre at De Montfort, and her research focused on territorial and local politics, devolution and regional inequalities, both in the UK but also in the comparative European perspectives as well. Recent work has been in areas concentrated on devolution deals in England, and in particular in the north, some of which we debated in the last session. And her work is around politics, governance, political economy of Northern England, and the changing landscape of local government. And this whole process now of asymmetric regionalism that's evolving in England. Over to you, Arianna.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to you and the organizers for the invitation. As James was saying, this is a very kind of important discussion, and I'm very glad that you invited me to be part of it. In my remark, I want to kind of pick on some of the themes that James has already emphasized, but I'll try to shift the focus on the specific case of England within the wider debate on the future of our constitution. So as James has emphasized, if the final goal when we think about the future of the UK is that of keeping the union together, then there is a need to ensure that all the pieces of the kind of multinational jigsaw of the UK fit together ultimately. So in essence, there's a need to focus on the individual nations, as in each of them, of course, there are contingent factors at play, but there is also a need to keep a broader constitutional picture in mind and ensuring that the union that comes out of that this constitutional discussion actually works as one. So this latter is like a kind of a critical point that has been, as Pauline also noted, has been missing so far. And while a lot of the debate in the past decades has focused in particular on the cases of what is happening in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the process of devolution, the claims for independence in these areas, and other various issues, England continues to be the hole in the middle of the devolution process. And there has been a consistent lack of reflection on the role and place of England in the debate on the future of the constitution. So in my remarks today, I want to focus on this, trying to unpack the kind of key issues that underpin the so-called English question, arguing that if we are to find a stable and long-term constitutional settlement within the UK, we cannot avoid anymore the question of England's governance. So in essence, if we look at like what we traditionally mean by the English question, usually there are two elements that are highlighted that characterize the English question. On the one hand, there is an issue of rebalancing the role and place of England within the context of a devolved UK. And then there is also the need to address the problem of over-centralization within England itself. Now, in addition to this, I would argue that there is also a third element that is emerging in a particularly strong way in the current context of the English question that has really started to emerge more distinctively in recent times. And that's the issue of territorial politics within England itself. The question of some regions within England having a stronger sense of identity, only some parts of England having devolution while others don't. So there is all these things kind of signal the presence of a growing chasm between different parts of England that perhaps suggests that there is not just one English question, but there are several questions that within England itself. So I'll try to cover each of these 3 points in turn briefly. So the first part of the English question, the idea of rebalancing the role and place of England within a devolved UK is of course a very difficult task. On the one hand, England has been long perceived as the core of the Union and in a way as the dominant nation of the United Kingdom. But devolution has challenged in a way this, because more than 20 years on, England is still far behind compared to the other UK nations, and it lacks a clear devolution settlement. At the same time, however, England is the site of the Westminster Parliament, is where the Westminster Parliament resides, and that means that there is a kind of a tension there. As James was mentioning, we need also to look back at the process of constitutional reform that was initiated in 1997. And back then, England was not involved in the process, in the same way as the other nations of the UK. And maybe precisely because England was conceived as the core of the Union, that the architects of devolution back then did not kind of deem it necessary to involve England in such process. And yet, this has had important implication in the longer term. The Westminster Parliament is increasingly perceived as an English-centric parliament on the one hand, that is not catering for all the needs of all the nations of the UK, and recent events like Brexit clearly reflect this. But at the same time, within England itself, there is an argument that goes that actually the Westminster Parliament itself represents in particular some parts of England and not others, and in particular the South. The idea of English votes for English laws was an attempt at kind of bridging parts of this problem, but obviously is only a partial solution to this issue of representation. In addition, and this also links to the second part of the English question, the lack of a coherent constitutional debate for England has also led over time to a process of devolution that is piecemeal, ad hoc, and incoherent within England. And so, as a result of this process really does very little in the way of addressing the core issues, which is over-centralization within England itself. At the moment, only a few parts of England have a mayor and a devolution deal, but the vast majority doesn't. And so this creates, while this process was aimed at kind of bridging existing divides, especially in socioeconomic terms, is actually, in fact, creating new divides, both in socioeconomic terms, but also in terms of political representation. So the result of the interconnection, if you like, of these issues is that there is still really unclear what is the actual purpose of devolution in England. So is it about rebalancing the economy and bridging the North-South divide? This is an argument that has been used for a very long time to kind of explain why we need devolution within England, to kind of bridge that North-South divide that is based on an economic rationale. But in recent times, there's also been some have also kind of argued that maybe the process of devolution that we see at the moment, it could also be read as a way of actually passing down the buck to combined authorities and local government in the context of a program of austerity. But all of this seem to be like the main kind of sort of aims pursued in recent year. But we know that the economy remains still profoundly unbalanced, and this is even more the case now in the context of the current pandemic and the crisis that stems from it. And meanwhile, new political divides and a sense of disconnect between people and politics has been emerging. So leaving England behind in the debate on constitutional reform has basically meant that questions of democracy and fair representation within England itself have not been tackled. And as a result, the devolution agenda has been perceived as something that is very much far removed from people's lives and from their day-to-day concerns. Some could argue that this perhaps was actually the precise aim of the current government when they started to develop the concept of devolution deals in England. Divide and rule, create a process of devolution that is economic in scope but contractual in nature and pays little attention to questions of democracy and identity, and so it can manage and be directed from the centre at its own terms and conditions. But as the former Secretary of State for Wales noted back in 1997, devolution is a process and not an event. And once it is set in motion, the central government, cannot control in full from the centre its direction of travel. So here we see this tension between an approach to devolution that is very much actually led by the centre, and what happens when you put devolution in practice. So even if devolution in England is patchwork and it doesn't make a lot of sense, it doesn't cover the whole of the nation, the fact that new institutions like metro mayors have been created means that something is happening. New political processes are in motion at grassroots level. And I think that this has become particularly evident in the context of the current crisis. And it was very much epitomized, for example, by the conflict emerged between the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and the Prime Minister during the summer. So the COVID crisis has really kind of had the kind of effect of laying bare the problems that of over-centralization in England is creating, and that sense of lack of power and of things being done to us, on us, and not for us, that James was mentioning earlier on. And so this is leading to shifts in public perceptions, especially in parts of England with a stronger sense of regional identity. For example, the north of England, but also Cornwall. And this leads to my final point. It looks increasingly like something is changing within England itself. While for a long time there was a kind of an assumption that there wasn't really a need to kind of think about a coherent process of devolution in England, because England didn't want it in a way, or didn't. There wasn't like any sort of pressure for it. I think that it's fair to say that something is changing within England itself. There are, for example, new publications that underline that Englishness is on the rise. But at the same time, I think that it's fair to say that also territorial identities are gaining salience in within England itself, and in the parts of the countries that have a stronger sense of regional identity, and these are increasingly being politicized. So again, the idea of the North-South divide, on which much of the fall of the Red Wall narrative that determined the result of the past general election, or the publication of books that try to unpack the idea of a northern question, are clear examples of this. At the same time, another kind of interesting phenomenon is the fact that new regionalist parties are emerging, for example, in the north of England, such as, for example, the Northern Independence Party, while other parties like the Yorkshire Party or maybe on Kerner in Cornwall are becoming more and more vocal. Now, these parties, of course, do not stand a chance to gain kind of a huge number of seats at Westminster. That is not the point. The point is that these are political parties that didn't exist until very recently, but they are there now. And so that signals the presence of something, of a kind of a tilt in the representation process with a strong territorial and identity basis that has not been catered for for a long time, and that kind of suggests that perhaps the English question is now morphing into a number of English questions rather. So, in this, and that the English question really cannot be captured in full, focusing only on the national scale. So these are these territorial and identity questions within England are largely ignored in political terms in the debate on constitutional reform, but it is becoming increasingly clear that ignoring them bears significant long-term risks. So to conclude, I think that leaving England at the margins of the debate on constitutional reform has generated several problems that cannot be ignored anymore. So devolution in England has developed in fits and starts, and as a result, it has taken a trajectory and a meaning that is very different from the path that we have seen in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And so reconciling this path, while also recognizing the distinctiveness of each nation and also the distinctiveness of different parts of these nations themselves, is essential to keep the Union together and find a sustainable constitutional settlement in the long term. So this, of course, requires a new kind of architecture and no more plumbing, to kind of borrow James' metaphor. And this time around, however, all the nations, all the constituent nations of the UK have to be part of this discussion and of the process, including England itself. My final point is very much on the lines of what James said in his conclusion, because I think that it is essential that if we want to achieve this very, very ambitious kind of aim, because of course this is no easy task, we have to keep in mind that it is essential to reform the centre itself. This is the point that has been missing from the debate on the Constitution since it started. There have been many attempts to address the Scottish question first, then the situation in Northern Ireland, in Wales. England has been left behind, but no reflection at all on the role of the centre and what is not working at the centre, and maybe trying to see that as one of the main problems that in turn reflect on the cohesion of the Union itself. Thanks very much.
Arianna, thank you. Thank you very much for that comprehensive approach. It leads to a lot of questions. We'll come back to the questions after our next speaker. But you mentioned the arrival or the development of sort of regionalist parties. They're relatively small, but they are a reflection of something. The interesting question for me is a lot of why are most of these individual parties that are rising like that, or movements, from the right rather than from the left? We'll come back to that question. Okay. Our final speaker before we go into questions is Dr. Paul O'Connell. Paul's the Reader in Law at SOAS. He's looking at the need for constitutional reform and the dangers of constitutionalism, and talking through new forms of democratic structures to shift power from the core executive to more participatory, dispersed forms of decision-making, but also protecting rights in an era of ongoing crises. Paul teaches public law and human rights and comparative law at SOAS. He's published on human rights and globalization, law and social change, and EU law. He's co-editing the handbook on law and Marxism to be published later this year, Paul, yeah, by Edward Elgar. He was a founding member of the Left campaign, and also is on the steering group of the Political Education Project, actually, which we're hoping from a lot from over the coming year. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks Pauline and Madeline as well for the invitation, and to John and Claim the Future for hosting it. I think the comments that have already been made by Arianna and James cover a lot of what I would have issues I would have touched on as well. But what I'll try and do to sort of pick up on the themes that John has mentioned there, and I'll try and do it as succinctly as I can at the time we have, is to say in the first instance that yes, we do need constitutional reform. We need deeper institutional reform in Britain, but politically we need to be very wary of constitutionalism, and in particular of the sort of fetishization and reification of constitutional change and constitutional politics. And I'll touch on some sort of alternative models and ideas around that and how we can engage with that. It's obviously a difficult balance to be struck. And also then the question of rights and how we protect rights. But to begin with, if I can sort of pick up on the metaphor that James used at the start when he talked about constitutions being like the rules of the game, and this is a sort of standard enough definition. You know, most people who work in the area and sort of teach or work in that area of constitutional law and public law use that metaphor. I suppose what I'd say is that actually, if we use the analogy of football, and let's say if we talk about the English Premier League and the rules of the game decide who wins the match, I suppose I'd say that there are much more important things that happen long before the players go out on the pitch that decide who will win the match. And this goes back to questions of who owns the clubs and how much they can invest. And there's obviously models out there that show that by and large, more times than not, the team that spends the most on players over the course of time tends to win the league. And constitutions are similar in a way. Karl Marx, in his early work and critique on Hegel's philosophy of law, Marx was comparing and contrasting monarchical versus republican constitutions. And he made the important and crucial point that these are really just constitutional forms, and the substance of the constitution exists outside of these forms. And so constitutions are fundamental about power, and the substance of what shapes those power relationships exists externally to the specific constitutional forms. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. And that's actually something that the British left has historically been aware of to some extent. So if you look at Ramsay MacDonald, for example, whatever his other failings and shortcomings, he was highly skeptical of models and plans for constitutional reform, dismissing them as will-o'-the-wisps that would just sort of lead people astray from the central issues of power and politics. Similarly, Harold Lasky and much more recently John Griffith, who was perhaps the most significant and prominent socialist constitutional theorist of the last 50 years, he fundamentally opposed the idea of sort of entrenching rights in a written form in the British constitutional system, of moving too fast down the road of decentralisation. And the reasons he opposed it were good reasons. And the basic political premise of it is that if you want to implement fundamental social change within the British state apparatus, you need to have power. And that if we go down this route of cutting off the avenues for exercising that power, that would undermine any future left government. Now, there are strengths and limitations to this analysis, and it brings us to sort of where we are right now. James and Ariana have mentioned it already, and it goes back to Badgett and even before that it's long been recognised that the fundamental problem with the British Constitution is the concentration of power within the executive. And interestingly, amongst the many constitutional reforms that were introduced by the Blair government from 1997 onwards, some of the biggest reforms were in the practice power. So the British executive was always dominant over the legislature, obviously always dominant over the regions and so forth. But under Blair, it became even more presidential, so that it shifted from just being the government that exercised the power to being more the core cabinet, and then even more so the prime minister and special advisors and so forth. So breaking with that is going to be crucial, and we do have to look at institutional reforms that would allow us to do that. I'm less concerned about the House of Lords. I'd happily see it abolished, but I think as a matter of priorities, I'd have it fairly low down the list at this point in time in terms of the crisis we face in Britain and the challenges we face around that. So absolutely, we need constitutional reform. We need to break with the power of the executive and how it's exercised. We need then to talk about this regionalism that Ariana has discussed, and also devolution around the regions, which is but as the Miller decision showed around the triggering of Article 50 to exit the European Union, when push comes to shove, Westminster still exercises decisive power over the devolved parliaments. So there is a need to continue to rethink that. I share the view expressed up to a point that, and this is one of Scotland's sort of best sons, James wrote this in the context of Ireland, where he said you could take down the British flag from Ireland, but unless you change the social relationships and the social the social reproductive order, that it won't fundamentally alter things. I think there is some truth to that, but I think ultimately the question of Scottish independence, and this goes back to this idea of devolving power and exceeding greater power to sort of wider sections of society, ultimately it's a question to be decided by the Scottish people, and it's a hard one to square, because again, the SNP, certainly the trajectory they're on is very much a classic bourgeois nationalist path with no real commitments to anything other than sort of formal constitutional change and no real commitment to any serious social change. But the actual independence movement in Scotland is much more vibrant and certainly much more progressive than independent movements we've seen in the 20th century. So my focus then in terms of how we think about going forward with constitutional reform is that we need to broaden, and the report that Pauline and others have produced touches on this, and also I think James made this point. We need to expand our idea of what is constitutional. We need to expand their idea of what is institutionally significant. And they mentioned the idea of a national investment bank, that this should be given a constitutional footing. And I think this is absolutely true, but I think we need to go beyond this. And if we're talking about fundamental constitutional change that transfers more power to people, then we have to be thinking through new institutional forms that are entirely original in certain respects and break with what the traditional reference points are for constitutionalism in Britain, or have been for the last 150 years. So one simple example would be the whole question of participatory budgeting. So there is a lot of this movement around the new Northern Independence Party, and Ariana mentioned the conflict between Andy Burnham and the Prime Minister over allocation of resources during and so forth. Well, one way concretely of addressing this, and a way which is constitutional in that broader sense, but a way which sort of pushes power beyond the existing structures, is to, for example, look to develop participatory budgeting as a standard practice in locals and local governments around the UK, and that would include the regional bodies as well. There are lots of examples of this and how it works. Certainly the Workers' Party in Porto Alegre in Brazil pioneered it, and there's a wealth of evidence that shows that it led to a decrease in inequality in that region, and also to sort of increased involvement and participation by working class communities in decision making, and that's crucially important. But of course the downside, and this brings us back to a bit of the bind and a bit of the sort of uncertainty we have around this, or the sort of core paradox, is that once a new president was elected, Bolsonaro became president, he immediately set about dismantling this sort of infrastructure. So this tension between devolving powers regionally and trying to open up new spaces, and how that relates to the remaining concentration of power at the executive level, is really important. And as I said, both James and Ariana have touched on this already. I think one concrete way of thinking that through is that, and it's quite mundane and quite boring, but the sort of electoral reform and changing the ways in which elections are contested within Britain, and trying to open up the space for smaller parties to have greater representation within Parliament, might create a dynamic. And again, there's no guarantee of this. I come from a system originally come from a system of proportional representation, and we still had the same two parties in government since independence, or swapping government between them since independence. So there's no guarantee about this. But going back to what Ariana just mentioned there about parties popping up, and some of them having a regional angle and different angles. Well, the whole point is the crisis we're currently living through, the pandemic associated with COVID, but the much deeper crisis of the capitalist system, which has been unfolding since 2007, is creating these opportunities for new political alliances and new political perspectives. One key constitutional reform should be around the voting system in Britain, and how we can sort of empower and give greater emphasis to smaller parties. That's not the be all and the end all in its own right, but it would be a key thing. Final point, sorry, I'm not I'm not too sure how we are for time. I'll try and or two. But the point on how we protect rights. Now, again, going back to this thing about the concentration of power in the executive in Britain, again, it's, as I said, it's not something new. It's something that has been a sort of structural element of the British Constitution since its inception, or since at least the Civil War. It's been a central part of it. Since the global pandemic and COVID started, the British government has added to itself a whole new raft of powers around sort of monitoring people's privacy, imposing fines upon people for breaching various regulations, a whole swathe of emergency powers. Now, Keith Ewing has written quite a bit on this, and others have written about it as well. the thing about powers adopted by the executive branch in emergency periods is that they tend not to be surrendered once the emergency passes. And the reality of what we're going to see in the coming years in Britain and elsewhere is that the COVID pandemic has accelerated an already existing and an already incipient economic depression, and that will worsen in the coming years. And this will see persistent long-term unemployment in Britain and throughout the UK. We obviously still also face the major crisis of climate catastrophe and climate breakdown. And on top of that, we have the rise, I think John mentioned this, we have the rise of various right-wing nationalistic and reactionary political forces. So we're definitely entering a period of political instability one way or the other. Now, historically for the left, that's an opportunity, and it will still be the case. But the British government and the British state has immense powers, immense coercive powers, anti-trade union legislation, these new measures brought in during COVID, and even before COVID, a whole raft of repressive measures. So there's a big question about how we protect rights in this context. And I don't have the time to go into all of this in great depth, but the Human Rights Act has proven itself to be singularly, I won't say useless, and I won't say entirely futile, but singularly weak in the face of the erosion of Britain. And again, there's a whole wealth of research on this, how the right to protest has been in the mind over the last 15 years, how the right to privacy, how the right to fair trial, all of these things have been undermined. And the UK courts, but also the European Court of Human Rights, has held that these various measures are consistent with the Human Rights Act. So to protect rights, we can't rely solely or even primarily on the Human Rights Act and that existing architecture. So the big question then is, what other measures could we put in place? And this again comes back to the question of devolving power and devolving focus. So one thing that Canada does, for example, is that they have, as well as having a national human rights commission, they have a federal human rights commission. So each sort of state within the Canadian Federation has its own human rights commission. And one thing we could look to do, as we talk about regionalism, as we talk about devolving power, is setting up independent human rights tribunals who would be separate from the existing state infrastructure and who would be empowered to engage in investigations, produce research, and support social movements that are pushing back against the encroachment on rights. And that's, again, I think James mentioned this already. Of course, the Human Rights Act doesn't protect socio-economic rights. This is something the Scottish Human Rights Commission has taken the lead on, but that isn't the case in Britain. And Philip Alston's recent report, when he visited Britain, highlighted the importance of this. But if we can widen out and make the participation and practice of rights a much more democratic process rather than something that's narrowly funneled into the Human Rights Act and into court cases, then there's another way in which we can expand our understanding of what is constitutionalism, push back against the sort of narrow constitutionalism that is the liberal tradition, and empower people to take control over decisions that affect their lives going forward. I'll stop there because I don't know how I am for time at all.
You've got plenty of time, Paul. That's all right. That was terrific. I forgot to mention that Paul's my Twitter conscience. If I've done something and I don't get a kicking from Paul on Twitter, I've a sense of relief. I must have done something right in my life. That was the thing. Thanks, Paul. That was really helpful. Right. We've had a few questions come in, but I want to try and throw some of the questions at you that have come in, but I'd also like you to all to think through and express any comments that you've got as well on each other's contributions. One of the questions that's come in, this is inevitable, isn't it? And I'll most probably get the blame for this, but I think a couple of people have come in and said, where does Northern Ireland fit in with all of this? And where do we go around that? And to be honest, it's something we can't ignore. At the end of the day, we rely upon the Good Friday Agreement and the eventual discussions around that. But I think we do have to address that as an issue, because you cannot isolate from the Northern Ireland from this whole debate. Any comments? Pauline?
Yes, just to really draw attention to the part of Remaking the British State document that tries to take this on board. It doesn't deal with the issue specifically of reunification, but it does insist that under a federal arrangement, each element has the right to cede from the United Kingdom. And that would include, of course, Northern Ireland. And the structure is there that would enable it to happen if there were to be a border poll that was successful. But what I would argue is that I don't want to be a persuader for that. I want that to be a decision of the people of Ireland, taken, within their own discussions. And I don't think we need to respect sovereignty, but not necessarily see our role as bringing that about. Now, I know not everyone will accept that approach.
Anyone else want to comment on that? So I think that's where we're at in our debate at the moment. That's the sort of, it's almost like a holding position that we take, and I think it deals with it well in the report. Can I just move on to one of the questions? Pauline, I think, eloquently set the debate off in terms of part of the discussions, but this isn't about a change of flags. This is about a change of politics. So one of the questions that's come in from Jack Jones, it says, with constitutional reform, should we be wary of the legal form distracting us from socio-economic factors and pacifying the masses with illusions of equality under the law, the rule of law, etc.? You're all nodding. Someone say, James, speak to us then.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely, and I think each of us would and did address that. I think Paul particularly very forcefully and very powerfully made that point, and the importance not of reifying constitutional politics. I think one of the things that often happens is that when we talk about the constitution, we do it in a very old-fashioned kind of way. In other countries, the constitution is about how you constitute yourselves. And we, people say we don't have a constitution. Well, we exist. We have been constituted, and that includes vitally important matters that are not always described as constitutional. So, for example, in many other countries, the kind of central bank would be seen as constitutional and it would be seen as very important. And that's one of the reasons why I think the reference in the report to the National Investment Bank is vitally important. So I think we've got to broaden out our understanding of what we mean by the Constitution. That's the only way in which I think we should, if you like, reify the Constitution. But even then, I'm not so sure about it, because ultimately it's only about constitutional power. We've got to take on board economic power, and we've got to address that. If we fail to do that, it's just playing around with, as your question raises, kind of legalistic kind of stuff.
Ariana.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that James made just now, when he was referring to other countries, on how these things work in other countries too. And I think that's a very important point, because one of the issues within the UK is that this debate is very, very insular. And there is very little, there is no process at all of trying to learn from what has been happening for many decades in other countries too. So, for example, again, referring back to the case of England, there is often an argument that, the idea of regionalism is dead because we voted against it in 2004, and regions are artificial. And so if they are artificials, they cannot work. Well, look around Europe, all regions are artificial. The difference is that regions in many countries in Europe actually have a lot of power. And when you put power into institutions, that's when they start to take root in the local communities. That's when they start to make sense for the local communities. The other point that I wanted to make in respect to examples from other countries is the idea that constitutions in most European countries actually protect territorial autonomies and local government. And this is not the case in the UK. That's a big exception. We are used to it because that's, the country where we live. We take this as the norm. But if you look across Europe, this is actually is an exception, is not the norm. And so not having that type of protection means that everything is incredibly unstable. Someone mentioned earlier on, the example of how local government institutions in London could be basically abolished over time, and the same could happen to devolved institutions. Well, in other countries, constitutions are there to protect territorial autonomies. That's a massive difference.
Paul?
So I think the question about legal forms is important. I think that legal form and legal content can't be separated out, and I think it is just a question of sort of practical politics as well. I think that the the tradition of constitutionalism, which is sort of what I wanted to try and put an asterisk over, is a liberal tradition, and because it's a liberal tradition, it encodes and it incorporates within it certain presuppositions about the absolute naturalness of inequalities, economic inequalities. That's just the way it is. You know, the sort of famous line Anatole France had, that the law in its majesty forbids rich and poor alike from begging on the streets and sleeping under the bridges. That's formal liberal constitutionalist equality. That's sort of how it works. The real danger now, and actually I think it is something that's important, and situating it in context, is understanding the relationship between politics, more broadly speaking, and constitution as an aspect of politics, but also as a branch of law, understanding how these relate. So, for example, the changes in Britain that have happened in the last 30 years, the constitutional changes, are linked fundamentally to global changes in the era of neoliberalism. So, growing executive power, the shift of power and decision-making to more elite bodies such as central banks, such as courts, and away from broader politics. That's part of a much broader global trend. So while much of the British analysis has been quite parochial, the actual British practice has fit into that global mold. You know, it sort of follows a similar trajectory in that sense. And where we are now, we're in this period of crisis, and there's a real danger, I think. And again, the document I've around Pauline, but it's a brilliant document. Is in the past, when the left has been defeated politically, it has retreated into constitutionalism as a sort of salve and as a substitute for engaging in broader politics. Now that is a real danger. That's what produced the Blair reforms from '97 onwards. It was Charter 88 and organisations like that sprung up following the defeats under Thatcherism, which began to focus on the questions because they've been decimated on the political field, including the dismantling of GLC and so forth. So where we are now and the scale of the crisis we're facing now requires us to really rethink that broader politics. And exactly as James said, so I mentioned John Griffith earlier. He had this lovely line that the constitution is what happens from day to day, and if nothing happens, that'd be constitutional too. And there's a lot of truth in that. So I think it's important to have this discussion because it breaks down this idea of a distinction between public political power and private economic power, and it says fundamental question of power in all of its forms and how we address that. I think that is the key thing.
Every now and again, it might be my connection, but you freeze, Paul. I'm not sure if it's my connection or yours, but I'm sorry about that. Pauline, do you want to comment?
Well, just briefly, I mean, I think what we've seen is, having been in the House of Lords now for about 2.5 years, we've suddenly got a rush of legislation coming through post-Brexit. And what most of the legislation is doing is bringing the neoliberal philosophies from Europe into the UK through trade, through the UK Internal Markets Act in particular. So today we hear that the British government is going to sidestep the regular funding process between Westminster and Scotland and Wales, and I assume Northern Ireland, and itself put money into projects. And these will be projects that it wants. It won't be projects for the people of Scotland. No doubt it will be put out to tender all over the world. It will probably bring in with it finance from all over the world, and any accountability to our economy in Scotland just won't exist. So I think that's an important part of a constitution, to protect the rights of the institutions that we don't have.
The interesting development in this debate is, and it's interesting, it came up in an extraordinary way, which is the John Penrose review of competition, which was a Conservative MP going about looking at competition law, how it should be reformed. But actually what it's done is opened up a discussion about the whole corporate capture of government, and not just this one, but for some period of time as well, because competition law has effectively been written by the corporations themselves and is being, actually that's being replicated at the moment if you look at some of the statements that are coming out of that review. So how do we tackle that issue of corporate capture, either through constitutional means or other means, because that's as it's the point that Pauline's making now. That's as important of capture of decision making by a certain powerful force within our economy and within our society itself. How do you overcome that? Comments? Paul, you're nodding.
Yeah, so I think it is a really important question, and I say this, sorry, so I'm partly influenced that I'm doing final edits on the chapters for this handbook on law and Marxism. So I'm very sort of heavily immersed in all of that at the moment, because there are important debates to be had. I mean, there's a big question, and this is a sort of important sort of methodological and sort of epistemological question, is do you get the particular sort of society because the laws made it that way, or rather do you get the laws you have because of the social relationships that constitute that society in the first place? Very much of the latter view. I think that fundamentally the law, whether it's in the EU, whether it's in Britain, whether it's at a global level with TRIPS and so forth, that basically this is a copper fastening of the existing broader social relationships of power. And the sort of very sort of anti-democratic character of the British Constitution today is linked to the anti-democratic character of capitalism and how the employment relationship operates in Britain and how people have no voice and no say in that. And it filters all the way down. I mean, the Northern Independence Party, I think, was hinted at earlier, and we may see disenfranchised Scouts are standing for them in election soon, or we may not. Sort of anti-democratic character is enshrined at every level of society because the Constitution is that way. So on that question of capture, depending on when you want to start the clock, really, I'll be as quick as I can. But the law has always, to one degree or another, enforced prevailing property relationships. There was only a very brief moment, and I think sometimes an awful lot of scholarship is misled. Brief moment we had post-World War II in the Western Europe and North America, and to a lesser extent Australia and Japan, where the state being much more actively to impose social limitations on what private power and capital could do. This historically was an anomaly. And if we talk about the history of capitalism, you know, if we go back 250 years, this historically was an anomaly. So it's not so much corporate capture as it is sort of corporate recapture. You know what I mean? That this was the norm previously. We had a slight aberration. Now, the reason we had that aberration was in part because of state intervention, but it was also because of levels of union membership, and because we had a social force that could impose different standards on capital. We've lost that in key respects right across the world over the last 40 or 50 years. So I think that, and again, we've had this discussion previously, John and Pauline as well, an event that I think from my perspective, and again, I teach law on a daily basis, so I'm not completely disavowing the importance of it. It is important. And I think Pauline mentioned this new legislation being introduced, which copper fastens these power relations and sort of gives them that legal veneer, that the legal questions and the institutional questions are important, but in order to get to them and in order to approach them in a way which will fundamentally change things, you have to be building a social base. And to do that, then you have to think about new forms of constitutionalism. As James mentioned and Paul in the report, that National Investment Bank, if you understand that as a constitutional issue, how is it governed? Democratically responsive to what powers does it have, but also participatory budgeting, community wealth building, a whole form of other processes. So I think it's a tricky question. Sorry, I tried to answer that briefly. I know I failed miserably.
Just as an aside, at the GLC, we introduced a form of participatory budgeting. We called them community areas. So no wonder we were abolished under Thatcher. You can see why, can't you, really? Vince Mills has put a question up. Oh, by the way, he said, actually, we used to call corporate capture state monopoly capitalism. Fair enough. But he put the question up, and this is for all of you, really, because this is quite interesting. But how would you square local engagement in economic decisions with the need for a central state power to achieve social state change? Ariana, actually tensions that are rising in terms of the regional structures that are established in England at the moment, this central state requirement, but at the same time, the tension about local decision making in that?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, the tensions are becoming more and more clear. And again, because the process at the moment is very much led by the center, and probably I should have been a bit clearer when I was making my point that we call it devolution, but that's not devolution. Let's make it clear. And that is the problem. If you really want to open up to local communities, you have to be there is the need for a willingness on the part of the center of letting go of power, and that is what is missing at the moment. There is no intention of letting go of power in England. There is no political devolution at all in England, and until that happens, well, that problem cannot be resolved, because on the one hand you have a rhetoric of empowering communities, but how can you empower communities if they do not actually have the funding, the actual powers to do the things that are needed on the ground? And that applies very much to the devolved structures that we see in England. We got metro mayors, but what kind of powers do they have? Actually, the areas on which they've been most successful in that sense is their soft powers rather than the powers that have been officially given to them by central government. So that's a tension that is becoming more and more clear in the current context, I think.
Soft powers by way of articulation of the community interest rather than actually being able to deliver much at all. Yeah. My own view is this, and I'm sorry if I come back to the GLC again, but actually the nature of local government as it evolved did have a series of quite powerful, almost city-states being developed from municipalization very early on. And I think the challenge is to central government created a tension that if you look at Owen Hathley's just done a book on the history of London government, if you look at the tensions between individual cities and central government, they were real conflicts. But it was interesting how often the individual cities won because of the mobilizations that undertook. But I could understand, my own view is I could see why Thatcher abolished the GLC, because we were a completely alternative economic model that she couldn't tolerate, really. I think it pushed her over the edge into instability, but that's another success on the part of the GLC. Ariana.
Can I just come back quickly on this point, because it's a very important one, because what you referred to, John, was, the idea of the local state, actually. Well, there is nothing that we can call the local state at the moment. There is nothing left of that. And that's why I think that, it's very good to think about things like participatory budgets, or even like opening up to kind of more forms of participatory democracy at large, at local level. The problem is that you can't do that if there is no more local state, if there is no more power in the local. So that's the contradiction that needs to be resolved, because we know that, community wealth building, participatory budgets, participatory democracy, these are all good things for democracy, but you need to have a local level that actually has power and funding and can function. Otherwise, none of this will work.
Yeah. Comments, anyone?
Sorry, Pauline. Sorry.
Pauline?
Yes, I think what we want to see across a number of things is some common standards that any citizen of the United Kingdom, Britain, or whatever we end up with are entitled to. And that any element within that can actually do more, but they can't do less. And that could be to do with, sort of benefits, or it could be to do with the rights to health, education, workers' rights, the environment, a whole range of things that there is a floor under which no one can go, but there is scope in the democratic structures to improve on them.
James?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've forgotten, and this is where an historical dimension is really important, is just the roles that local authorities played in the past. I'm currently writing a book on local governance in Scotland over the course of the last century plus. And it's remarkable, the kind of initiatives. And actually some of the great ideas that we have today, we take for granted, and we associate with the centre, came from local initiatives, including the health service. And I think that's something that we've lost sight of. And that's where I think Ariana's point is really important, because we are very unusual in the UK in terms of the degree of centralisation. Very unusual in the extent to which we do not permit that kind of innovation. At the moment, I think we've moved to a system whereby, frankly, and this is true within Scotland as well as in the UK, basically local authorities deliver things that they're told to deliver by the centre, and they've got incredible lack of autonomy, even in determining how it should be done. And that I think stifles innovation, stifles new ideas, ideas, and that's a very bad thing. So just to kind of get away from that, and really, I think there's a big issue about how you entrench those rights, and that, in a sense, is where I think interesting. I mean, it wasn't explicit in the report, but I think, you know, if we were to have a House of Nations and Regions, we'd have to look at the different powers of that second chamber as compared to the House of Lords. And I would anticipate that the one thing they would be able to do would be to veto, the right to veto any attempt to undermine local authorities or regional authorities. So we could start to think about, you know, even a form of entrenchment without the kind of legal written constitution, if that's a step too far. But we've really got to get back to, you know, much more empowered communities as well. And also, one thing I'd be wary of, and I'm glad that Paul raised the participatory budgeting. PB is a really good idea, but we in Scotland, we've got community empowerment legislation in the statute book. It's pretty meagre, and of course, it's presented as if it's really bold and all the rest of it. It's pathetic, frankly, and it is only applied to local government, not to other public services coming under the Scottish Government. So I think, you know, I'm not criticising at all what Paul was saying. I am saying we've got to take this seriously in the way that Paul was indicating.
I'll bring Paul in a minute, but just on the point you made there, Jess, how do you entrench what Pauline is saying by way of a set of rights other than by a written constitution?
Well, the way I would do it, certainly in terms of devolved government, would be to have this House of Nations and Regions with the right to veto anything coming from the Commons. So if the Commons, for example, came along with another bill to get rid of the GLC, there's the second chamber would be able to say, no, you're not getting to do that. It wouldn't be overruled. So I think if you could do it that way, then that would be a start, at least. Also, I think, you know, once you get a more powerful local authorities across the country and gain their legitimacy, it'll be much easier to defend it. Because really what we've seen is a gradual erosion over decades of local government. But it's a tricky one, and I don't think there's an easy answer to the entrenchment point.
Yeah, I'll bring Paul and then Ariana. Okay, Paul.
So I think James's point is really important. And again, I'm almost certain it was where a Tory council introduced a form of participatory budgeting, but the question people were asked was which service they wanted to see cut. So absolutely, the form itself isn't the answer, but I think more the question it raises is the key thing, that it sort of broadens the discussion of what is and what isn't constitutional. There's an important point, and it goes back to Vince's question, because I think it is a crucial, and Ariane is absolutely right about and James as well, about the absolute gutting over the last 40 years. But again, I think you have to situate that in a global context. There are regional and different variations that depend on the specific histories of government and so on. But you take Barcelona, for example, right? And you take sort of Ada Colau as the mayor of Barcelona, and this is really held up as a model of municipalism and so forth. But yet when push came to shove, the Spanish executive reserved the power to intervene, to impose very severe limitations. And then also the power of the purse was retained in very key respects, which forced Colau into adopting policies which were at variance what she committed to at the outset, which undermined the social movement that was part of it. So there's a very tricky question. I don't have the answer to this. Again, I think this is a very serious question for us to consider, because if we are going to try and improve and try and extend power at a local level, the only way you can do that in Britain at the moment is because the executive dominates Parliament. We all, you know, we can have the illusions of parliamentary sovereignty, but the executive dominates. So it's only through getting a government, or at least now, in the absence of that, this brings it, and if I can just very briefly say this, the whole thing behind constitutions is the idea of a constituent power, right? And so normally that we the people have given ourselves this constitution, we the people shape it. And that remains the case, right? Whatever about all the problems of that abstraction, and it always masks more than it reveals. What we need, if we're going to get any of these constitutional advances in Britain today, or in the UK, or in independent Scotland, or whatever the case may be, we need to build a social movement around it. Now, the biggest advances in democracy in Britain occurred not because of sort of well-intended sort of Fabian reformists, but because of social movements that impose those demands on the British ruling class. And that's what we lack at the moment for a whole variety of reasons. Now, there are fragments of it. There are really active tenants unions. Exactly. There are some trade unions that are very active on certain issues, but we're going to have a massive number of unemployed workers in the coming years. And that needs to be anticipate it in advance and to build a movement around that can impose demands on it. Basically, we need to sort of reclaim some of the energy of the Chartist tradition. We need to sort of have a set of demands, this minimum that Pauline talked about, and sort of have a movement that pushes these demands. Because the only way, this goes back, it was recently Frederick Douglass's birthday, and this goes back to Frederick Douglass's point that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And so we need a movement that can extract these constitutional reforms, but constitutional in that much broader sense. I suppose the point I'd make is that in building that movement, getting rid of the House of Lords will be an incidental thing that gets done along the way, and other issues will be much more significant.
My broadband's playing up, so the constitutional demand for a right to free broadband is going to be central to any movement I'm involved in. Ariana.
Just very briefly on the point on how you kind of protect the powers of subnational governance in general. I think a very important shift that we need to see in that sense is a shift from the current model, which is a competitive model of subnational governance, to one that is more cooperative. And that's, if you take the case of England, is very, very evident in the model of devolution that is in place at the moment, that is based on competition. You have to go and compete for a devolution deal, ask for permission for it. That gives you a sense of, where power lays eventually. So the model has to become more cooperative. And this cooperation has to be across local authorities, but also between subnational governance and central government. And for that to happen, again, if you look at the example of other countries, it's important to have some points of contact, official points of contact, not just the local government association playing a kind of a role that is pretty much kind of just advisory on certain matters, but having like an official forums that brings together the voice of local authorities and subnational governance and can be heard, but heard and listened, not just like without any kind of consequence by the center. And so again, looking at what is happening in other countries like Germany, Italy, in that sense, is very important, because these bodies are the norm in most places. It's just here that we need to do more in that sense.
Yeah. Final question. We've only got a few minutes left. By the way, we've put Pauline's report up in the up on the web, on the links and all the rest of it, so people can access that. I think we've also put it on the Claim the Future website as well, but so please do go to that. It's what kicked off a lot of this debate, certainly within the labour and trade union movement at the moment. Final question, next steps. James, what's the next step in this debate?
I mean, I think the key issues here are to get ideas, policies, leadership and mobilisation. And I think this is a good starting point. And I think the report is a wonderful way to stimulate that debate. There needs to be leadership, which I have to say ain't there at the moment. I mean, I don't know what the official position of the Labour Party is on this. You've got this phenomenally important report, and I think it was released, I'm not sure what status it currently has. So anyone who can encourage it to be given somewhat more official status and then to get behind it. And not to say it can't just be, introduced like that. There's a lot in it. And I know Pauline would be the first to say it's about stimulating the debate, but that's where we have to go. So it'd be these three ingredients, which is always the case. These are always the ingredients.
Paul?
Yeah, so I think that things like this are useful, but I think broadening that out is key now. I'm not sure how many people are logged on and sort of and watching and taking part in this, but broaden that out. So I work with the Political Education Project, and we're trying as best we can to have this sort of, even with all the limitations of COVID, to have this sort of Freudian bottom-up grassroots discussion of important ideas. And that's, again, it's not just for show, it's not just some sort of abstract academic idea. It's because fundamentally it's based on the idea that the working class and the people have the answers. They just need to get together and be having those discussions. So having these debates is important, having these discussions. What this report that Pauline and others have produced is really important. I can only assume the Labour leadership has abstained on what they're going to do with the report or not do with the report. But the key thing is building a social piece that is taking these conversations seriously and trying to mobilize that around issues. I mentioned the Chartists. Again, it will become an issue of boiling these things down to some core demands and mobilize around that. In the past, we've had anti-austerity movements and needed in its time. Now we need a movement that's demanding something, that's making specific demands about the sort of world we want to see. And I think that's emerging organically in lots of small ways, but we need some way to bring all that together, and then we can start pushing these debates forward, I think.
Yeah, Ariana.
What I wanted to say is very much along the lines of what Paul just said. So I'll just make an addition to that. I think that bringing in the people and the view of the people is absolutely essential, because if there is one thing that has become increasingly clear in the current context is that people feel that politics is too distant, and that maybe there is a need to show that how and why this conversation matters to people in their day-to-day life, and that requires perhaps a bit of a change of language as well. We need to have to use a language that makes sense to the average citizen, and so not engage in like kind of complex kind of academic or overcomplicated debates, because these are things that really, really matters. They have very practical implications in our day-to-day lives. And from my experience working with communities, especially in the north of England, when you sit down to people and you speak the same language, that's makes a massive difference and brings the people in.
Pauline, this is a report that dare not speak its name, isn't it, really?
Yes, yeah, I have to confess.
See what you've started. But actually, your report actually has started and forced elements from the Labour and Trade Union and progressive movement now to think again about all of this. Where do you think we go next?
Well, I'm also glad to see it's really upset the Sun and the Daily Mail. But that's another story. I should just say the Labour Party hasn't officially put this out, and I have to take responsibility for having put it up on for public discussion, and hopefully the leadership will take it on board, and whatever happens to the Constitutional Commission that they're launching, I don't think we can wait on that.
Yeah.
We've got to have something to say earlier. Scotland, we can't wait, definitely. Wales, I would say the same. We've got elections coming up in 8 weeks' time that can crucially affect the direction we're going in. And I think that we need to work across the whole of Britain to prefigure any constitutional change we see in the future. Just because the institutions haven't been set up by the government doesn't mean we can't be talking to each other. Yeah. And I think next month's Claim the Future event, which is actually on the campaigning issue, with speakers from Wales, from the north of England, and from Scotland, and John, as I'll see him as the London representative now. We should be able to start having these discussions and work out a way of how we can feel fairly represented. And while the House of Lords isn't a priority, I wish you would just put it up a bit. We do need some way of eventually having discussions that give a voice to cross-territorial issues. And I see no reason why that shouldn't be take the money and the infrastructure of the House of Lords and claim it for that. Yeah.
I'll never forgive myself for forcing you into the Lords, Pauline. I'm really sorry, but it has been productive. You've created this debate, which is fantastic, really. Thanks all the speakers as well. I hope people have found that interesting. And Pauline said that our next one is then how do you make that a reality in terms of campaigning? Just as a complete aside at the end, I'm reading Martin Empson's book at the moment, which is about class struggle and changing the English countryside. And I've reading about Kett's Rebellion. It's quite interesting because that was against the central state and the enclosure policy at the time. And it was the economic interests of working people being threatened in that way, and they rose up against it. But in their demands, it wasn't just the end of serfdom as well they were calling for. They wanted the election of local officials. So it was the first, one of the earliest demands for literally to elect people again, because they did have it previously in the hundreds, the unit that that they used at the time. So it's quite interesting that the history of that local demand for just to have a say. I have to say, Martin Empson's book is Kill All the Gentlemen. That's the title of the book, but I'll leave it there. Okay. Thanks for everyone coming along, and thanks for all of you for participating. We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us, and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.